I think it was a big step into the unknown that every parent experiences. But for us, it felt like we're committed to this kind of mitzvah of continuity. You know, one of the big challenges of gay love is that gay love is never generative of life. And there's a resistance in the gay community to recognize the disability of that. So I wanted to kind of push back and say, look, it's a separate mitzvah. There's a mitzvah of not to be alone, and a mitzvah of growing emotionally with another person, even without children. And there's dignity in that. And there are other things one can do to nourish a world you will not see. But being a parent is one of the most profound. And I didn't want to leave the planet without doing it. And I remember in those first, moments after she was born in Mumbai, India, I remember her staring up at a mobile, looking at all these things move, and realizing that it was now upon us to figure out how to prepare a world that would be habitable for her, given that it wasn't so clear how a kid who was raised by two Orthodox parents who were both Abba and Daddy would manage in the world.
That was Rabbi Steve Greenberg discussing the song Like Sailors, which Liz Hanellin and I wrote after being inspired by Psalm 148. I'm Shep Rosenman. This is The Rest is Commentary, where we discuss what songs inspired by the Psalms, or Tehillim, inspire in my guests. Steve received his BA in philosophy from Yeshiva University and his rabbinical ordination from Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. He served as a senior teaching fellow at Klal, the National Center for Learning and Leadership, a think tank, leadership training institute, and resource center in New York City for over 20 years. He is the first openly gay Orthodox rabbi and a founder of the Jerusalem Open House, the Holy City's LGBTQ+ community center. After coming out publicly in 1999, Rabbi Greenberg appeared in the film Trembling Before God, a documentary about gay and lesbian Orthodox Jews. Steve joined the filmmaker Sandy Simcha-Dubowski in an outreach project in which the film sparked dialogue as a tool for spiritual renewal, social change, and communal engagement. Steve is presently the founding director of Eshel, a North American support, education, and advocacy organization for LGBTQ+ Orthodox Jews and their families. He lives in Boston with his husband, Stephen Goldstein, and their daughter, Amalia. You can find out more about Steve and Eshel at www.eshelonline.org. That's ESHEL online.org. In this episode, we discuss sea monsters, different types of prayer experiences, making improvements today for the benefit of the future, linear time, circular time, and slinky time, the difference between sailing on the ocean and sailing on a river, inviting strangers to your home, stories to help us understand each other, and so much more. Let's start off by listening to Like Sailors.
You're lying in your tiny bed, gazing at what's overhead. A sun, a moon, a rocket ship, suspended from a wooden strip. Each one hangs by a string, and then your mama starts to sing. May your children be like stars that anchor sailors to the sea, and may they be like sailors too, awash in the enormity, awash in the enormity
So it really is great to see you. Let's dive in. I write these songs and I feel like they come to me in a way that connects me to that which is greater than myself, the muse, God, data that we can't understand, whatever it is. And so I feel like they're a bit of a gift to me, and it's not enough for it to stay there. I want to take that which I'm connecting to and offer it to people. And so I've offered this one to you. In fact, you chose this one. And I want to get a sense of, in the same way that I was inspired by the Psalms to write this with my writing partner, Liz Hanellin, what did it inspire in you? Obviously, you chose it, so there's probably not loathing unless you want to really call me out on that. I'm hoping it's love or curiosity or questions or something like that.
I actually find this psalm to be one of the most moving portrayals of a certain kind of religious experience that I'm familiar with. It puts into words a kind of kaleidoscope of awareness that, like open your eyes and pay attention because this has all been gifted to you. The language is so gorgeous. It's the height of religious poetry in a certain sense because it's fueled by gratitude, but the data points are experience. And so it's Taninim v'chol tehomot, the sea monsters in all the depths, which if you think about it, of course, that reminds you of Genesis 1, the sea monsters and the depths, right? Which are all, in a way, potentially dangerous, but now all part of the economy of creation. The intensity of the meter that also carries you through image after image after image. It's a list of powerful images. Fire and hail, snow and vapor, wind, storms, all fulfilling his word. Mountains and all hills, fruit trees and cedars. And it moves through creation and then ends up with human beings. It's just an incredible portrayal of our belonging to a kind of gifted reality of the senses and of the experience that is just remarkable. And in a way, for a religious reader, this, for me, is one of the foundations of faith. And that is, I didn't invent myself. Here I am. I open my eyes, and all around me is this wild, cacophonous splendor. So that's one side of this. It's just that it's experientially and in terms of the language, incredibly beautiful. But there's another piece here, which is that I love it because it brings back to me that all of creation is either being invited to praise or is already doing it. In other words, existence is itself almost identical with praise. And so on some level, prayer then becomes joining in a choir already in motion.
I love that. That's so beautiful. But I will sometimes walk into synagogue, to shul, and just not feel like I can connect with whatever is going on in that particular shul. But if you're already kind of diving into something that's going on outside of the shul, now all of a sudden you're connected to something much greater than yourself. That's really beautiful.
I mean, I have to admit this sheepishly, but I can, of course, feel this much more potently when I'm davening in the midst of a natural setting.
Sure.
It's harder when there are a lot of walls and distractions around this experience.
It's the Breslover chassid in you.
I don't think I'm alone in this. During COVID, we had to daven outside, and davening in the midst of all these trees and greenery and the sunshine, it was glorious. And I'm going to miss going back inside the walls.
You've gone back inside the walls, or you're going to...
I think that we're now back in the social hall.
But why? I memean, obviously during the winter months in Massachusetts, outside may not be a choice, but for 6 months of the year...
It's an interesting point, but I think that there are reasons that traditionalists, like what they did yesterday. I think there are structural reasons in terms of people being able to hear more effectively and the sound feeling fuller. Because when you're outdoors, nature is present, but the sound goes out rather than reverberating. And so the kihila doesn't feel like it's as aware of itself. So there are downsides in the outside.
Sure.
State. I'll tell you what also comes to mind for me in this is that in joining, it reminds me the notion of tshuva of Rav Kook. Who basically has a notion of tshuva that all... Tshuva
meaning return, repentance.
Repentance says that repentance isn't what we think it is. It's not regret. And I mean, of course, it expresses itself in regret and change and self-reflection and all that. and decision to move forward in better ways. But basically what Rav Kook says is that all creation is magnetized to the divine essence and is all in a process of self-improvement. Creation is movement of matter to become moving, and moving matter to become living, and living matter to become feeling, and feeling matter to become sentient, and sentient matter to become moral. In other words, all of creation is being pulled toward refinement. That magnetism is tshuva. And so Rav Kook says that every social improvement, every personal, characterological improvement, every new commitment to care more deeply or to respond more fully or to fully achieve your values, all that stuff, you're joining the world in its movement toward perfection. So again, it's the same thing, is that tshuva, like prayer, when the hills and the skies and the stars and the plants and the Leviathan are all praising God, joining in is that prayerful feeling of like, I'm just going to climb onto the train, but there's another train, and that is this train of amelioration, which is the train of tshuva. And therefore, this psalm allows me to feel that my quest for modest improvements in behavior are part of the entire world moving toward perfection.
It's so beautiful. And it's very much akin to language that I believe is attributed to Dr. King, but was actually Dr. King quoting someone else whose name I don't remember. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I love this idea of magnetism, but it also makes me ask the question, what happens when we step away from the improvements, when we're making improvements in social justice or gay rights or women's rights, and then we find ourselves in situations that we're finding ourselves, whether in Israel or the United States, forget about what's going on in Iran and other places like that. Or don't forget about it. I mean, those are all part of this epidemic of movements away from what some of us see as improvements.
Well, yes, that's why this psalm is a little bit more, as is Rav Kook, a little bit more certain of the directionality of history than we below often experience, but that may be just the failure of the fraction of our lifetime. In a moral frame, I think this is actually a really important moral point for me, is that the covenant is about committing to a world you will never see by making modest improvements around you that will need to become a piece of a larger wave building that only future generations will fully reap the benefits of.
Right.
That, in other words, covenant isn't about, getting it done. It's lo alecha hamlacha libor. The work is not for you to finish. Lo ata ben churn li batamena, but you've got to do your part.
Right. So basically, just to kind of reframe the response, I think what you're saying is whatever dips back we have away from the movement towards, they're just blips on the screen. And over time, it could be another 2,000 years. It could be another million years. We will eventually achieve the aspirations of this Tehillim and fully return.
I think it was Eliada said that Jews invented linear time, that until the Jews, time was circular. Everything had to go back to the beginning and nothing would change. And then Jews created this notion of time where you leave Egypt and you never return, where Sias goes back, but Jews do not go back to Egypt. That's linear time. But of course, if you look actually the cycle of our holidays, it is circular. So someone once said that Jews believe in slinky time. Yes, we go back and then we go forward. We take 2 steps back and 3 steps forward and 4 steps back and 6 steps forward. And in the aggregate, let me put it this way. It has to do with my character, which my family will attest to. I'm a hopeless optimist. I tend to feel that even if I'm wrong, believing that things will get better is the only way to live.
Well, that also reflects itself in the work you do. By the way, that's, I think, at a core ethos of Jewish philosophy. Every day, at least 3 times a day, we are asking for the redemption, the Geulah, which requires us, even in the most dire of circumstances, to be hopeful for something better. It's not enough to simply wait. You have to play your part in bringing it. And so To what extent do you think about that in your work?
So, involved over the past, this point, almost 20 years in moving the challenges of sexuality and gender that both that LGBTQ identities have shaped for traditional societies to move it forward. And so I'm part of a team that created an organization called Eshel, which is a tamarisk tree that Abraham and Sarah plant outside their tent to signal welcome. It flowers pink in the middle of the desert. And so we do education and advocacy and support for LGBTQ Orthodox Jews, their family members, working with synagogues and schools and summer camps and all kinds of institutions that are traditional minded to nonetheless make space for queer identities. And in that work, no doubt, there's a good reason to doubt that it will come swiftly, and good reason to believe that over time, from the ground up, it will move. It already has, and it's going to continue to do so, in part because, you can go back to the Psalm. The fullness of creation is not only the stars and the moon and the mountains and the hills, but the kings of the earth and all peoples, princes and judges and young men and maidens and old men, old people and children. In other words, human beings of all kinds. The word that appears in the Psalm more than any other is the word kol.
Mm-hmm. As in all rather than as in voice.
As in everybody, yep. As in all things, as in all existence. And while God is separate from the creation, this is Jewish theology, God is not identified with the creation, but the creation is sacred in its totality. And therefore, the work, while I'm sure, my colleagues, not all my colleagues will agree to this, I believe the work for making room for the presence, for the acknowledgement of the presence of LGBTQ folks within the economy of a very complex and rich world is a piece of this sum. We should find a way for the riches of the creation to be present in our communities and our families, in all the ways that everyone might want.
Well, that goes back to one of the first things you said in our conversation. The Psalm also talks about the sea monsters, and sea monsters in theory are scary. At a minimum, they're in a dark, cloudy place, and that in and of itself is scary unless you've been down there and safely kind of swam with them, which is not the experience that most of us have, except perhaps if you're a sailor or someone who is like an ocean goer. So what the Psalm seems to be saying is even that which we are afraid of is part of the praising of creation. And I mean, that also, as uncomfortable as this will make my wife, that also means that people who seem to get in the way of political agendas that include LGBTQ and treat women equally and treat people of different financial and social classes and ethnic backgrounds differently. Those people also are part of praising creation and moving back. If it's coal, it's not coal except for the people who don't agree with us. It's coal. Everything, everyone.
You're inviting us to talk about the dangers of cancel culture, which are all around us. And the work I do, I end up trying to hold the middle.
Right.
When the people on the left want to consider the people on the right completely off the, moral landscape and the other way around. And my job is to make the best argument for my opposition.
Right. So
that I understand them and then can find a way to navigate together. It's not always possible. There's an argument to be made that this psalm is that God has tamed the sea monster and the depths is for the redemption.
Right.
Presently, the sea monster is not tamed.
Right.
The depths are still quite treacherous. And so one could make the argument that this is a messianic portrayal, not a contemporary portrayal where our experience may be that there are sea monsters that we need to fight rather than join.
And that brings us back to why we ask for the geula so many times a day, the redemption. This relates back to your point about linear and slinky time. I think we are asked to live in the now and live in the future. We do all these rituals, we have all these holidays because we are asked to live in the past. So in a way, God is asking us to be Haya, Hoveh, V'Yihiyeh, to be past, present, and future. So we have to hold this, and there's a complexity to, I was first going to say, there's a complexity to being Jewish, but I don't think it's just being Jewish. It's having an attitude that aligns with Jewish perspective. You can be Muslim, you could be atheist. It doesn't matter as long as you are connecting with the past and focusing on a future in which much of what ails us or all of what ails us goes away. Like, how do you hold all of these things, especially given your work and the run-ins that you see the families that you're supporting have? You know, like, I ran Jewish organizations for 20-something years, and as inspiring as the experience was, there are moments where like, oh my God, it's really like herding cats. I can't do this anymore. Kal vachomer, I mean, how much more so when you are dealing with more than just straight ahead learning, straight ahead creating communities of learning, but instead you are dealing with people's lives on a daily basis and trying to kind of help them feel supported and help navigate the, turbulent waters, to stick with the metaphor.
Well, I once was on a rafting trip talking about waters down the Colorado River, and this 18, 19-year-old guide turned to me one day and said, "Rabbi, I think you misunderstand something." He said, "You think you're on an ocean. You're not. You're on a river. On an ocean, you had better look up to the stars. You'd better know where you are, and you'd better be able to direct yourself carefully to gather information and to stay responsive and responsible to exactly what has to happen there. On the river, you can't fight the river. You can avoid stones and the rapids here, but you're going to, a little bit here, a little bit there, but you got to know how to let the river take you where it's going."
Mm-hmm.
So part of the work for us is to figure out where we push back, where we navigate, where we seek information and wisely discern, and where we just let a process unfold. Because sometimes if you impose your will in a process, you end up just on the side of the river. Instead, you have to realize that there are moments in which you have to just let a process unfold, and you are helping to avoid the pitfalls, but nothing more.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my work, I always have to remind myself that it's really important not to impose ocean conditions on a river or river conditions on an ocean.
It's beautiful. So you're more like the river guide than the sailor awash in the enormity. But of course, because you chose this psalm and this song, obviously that spoke to you as well. And in our email we exchanged last week, you talked about how it connected you back to your daughter's earliest days. So tell me about that.
So Steve and I met in 1999 and immediately connected and started a life together. But it was really unclear to me how it would be possible for two guys to kind of make this happen.
Especially two guys named Steve.
Correct. We ended up deciding, because, by the time we found each other, I wasn't a young man. And the very notion of embarking on this project of parenthood so late with such costs of various kinds, and I think it was a big step into the unknown that every parent experiences. But for us, it felt like we're committed to this kind of mitzvah of continuity. One of the big challenges of gay love is that gay love is never generative of life.
Right.
And there's a resistance in the gay community to recognize the disability of that.
Right.
And so I wanted to kind of push back and say, look, it's a separate mitzvah. There's a mitzvah of not to be alone, and a mitzvah of growing emotionally with another person, even without children. And there's dignity in that. And there are other things one can do to nourish a world you will not see. But being a parent is one of the most profound. And I didn't want to leave the planet without doing it. And I remember in those first, moments after she was born in Mumbai, India.
What's her name?
Amalia. Amalia Dvorachain Greenberg Goldstein.
That's a mouthful.
Big name for a little girl. And I remember her staring up at a mobile, looking at all these things move, and realizing that it was now upon us to figure out how to prepare a world that would be habitable for her, given that it wasn't so clear how a kid who was raised by two Orthodox parents who were both Abba and Daddy would manage in the world. And so it was clear to me that I had to kind of both take responsibility for that and be trusting. We say to our kids, it's going to be all right.
Right.
And we don't know that. And so on some level, there's a certain kind of like commitment and trust that is about being a parent altogether that we're just banking on it's going to be all right.
Right. Bringing back your river guides metaphor, does that mean parenting is like being on an ocean or like being on a river? Because taking responsibility suggests the ocean, knowing where you are and the stars and paying attention to the tides. But trusting suggests letting the river take you where you want to go. Or is it some combination depending on the moment?
Of course, there are moments when I realize she's asking us to direct her, even though she's resisting it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are moments when I think I've got to direct her and she's saying, Abba, just let me go.
Yeah.
And I realize that as she gets older, it's more rivers than oceans.
We just had this conversation with Maya last night. She's in graduate school and we're still, as parents, you sometimes get overly involved. And by the way, the risk on the other side is you're not involved enough. So you have to find that balance of trust and, taking a more ownership stakeholder perspective. You used the language before that your family would refer to you as a hopeless optimist. Hopeless suggests hopeless and optimist don't align for me.
What that just meant was unabashedly and foolishly optimistic. In other words, hopeless means there's nothing they can do about it. But I would say that optimism is by definition, my commitment to serious religious life is all about optimism.
Mm-hmm. Is that a choice you had to make or is it your natural inclination?
Well, a little bit of both. I would say that I was born into a very Jewish family, but not a religious family. And deciding to be religious was not about knowing a particular set of truths, but about committing to them.
When did that happen? How did that happen?
I was 15 years old. I think it had some, and I became, by accident, I ended up at an Orthodox rabbi's shul, and he invited me to Shabbos lunch.
And where was this? Where did you grow up?
Columbus, Ohio.
Oh, wow.
And it was drizzling one day, and I wanted to walk to shul because I'd been to Camp Ramah. And so my mother said, no, you're driving. And then I said, I'm walking to the Orthodox shul. I was like this, rebellious 15-year-old. And the rabbi invites me to Shabbos lunch. He's from England. And he, invites me to study Torah with him and Shabbos afternoons. And I think this is a wild, mercurial English fellow. He's interesting. And I brought my friends in. Within 6 months, we were all observant. And I think if you would ask me, I would have said that I was already at the age of 15, aware that I would need resources to get by in life that were uncommon, that were not obvious to an ordinary American cultural Jewish kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to look for them.
So if you were aware at that age, was this something you were able to confide in your friends or this rabbi, or did this all come much, much later?
Well, at 15, I became religious, and I would say that I just fell in love with the Talmudic wordplay, and here's what I felt. I felt like my grandfather had died in Auschwitz. My mother's a survivor, and he likely did not possess a full sense of what they were hauling him to Drancy into Auschwitz for. He was a largely secular Jew and had moved from Odessa to Paris. In other words, I kind of felt like it was my job to figure out what was in the backyard of our family's memory that led to his being gassed in Auschwitz.
Mm.
So I felt responsible in that regard. And then I was swept away by Psalms like this, by reading Eshel's The Sabbath, and by experiencing, this is one thing that perhaps doesn't maybe fit in this, but, Eshel does a national event called Eshel Across America, where on the Shabbat, when Abraham welcomes in the three angels and plants an Eshel tree, we encourage Jews to open their homes to strangers.
Mm.
And we encourage the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, because there's nothing like the openness to difference that characterizes what is unique about Abram that got him chosen for this mission.
Sure.
Not to be afraid of what you are unfamiliar with, to invite total strangers in and take care of them.
Right.
And that is what saved my mother's life. And that ultimately is what this rabbi did when he invited me home to Shabbos lunch. And ultimately, it's what I'm doing, what Eshel is doing across the country as well.
Sure. That's so beautiful. It's very powerful. I mean, we are asked to do this on Pesach too, and also on Sukkot. So, we are told over and over again in the Torah to be kind to strangers because we were strangers back in Egypt. And the point to me seems to be get to know people who are different from yourselves. For some people, the boundary of that may be, I'm not comfortable encountering someone who's not Jewish, so I'm only going to get to know other Jews. I go to the B'nai David Judea, I'm going to get to know people who go to the Young Israel. Right now, these are different flavors of modern Orthodox. That may be the narrow band for you. And then for others, I think like you and me, like, okay, let me talk to someone who's really different, from a different place, different ethnicity, different religion, different financial situation. And Sherry and I are very much in that space. We try whenever we can to encounter people, especially people who are other, because I don't know if this is true for you, but I feel like I'm other. It must be true for you in ways that it's not true for me, but I never felt like I fit in. And even though I have a bajillion friends and I'm part of a bajillion communities and I recognize that I'm part of something, I still feel like I'm other.
I think this is so fundamental a Jewish teaching. Abram is called Ivri. He was on one side of the world, everyone was on the other. And the whole commitment to being open to the unfamiliar is actually central to the Jewish idea. There's a text that I love to teach around this to teenagers. And in fact, when asked to teach about homosexuality, this is what I teach, that there's this young couple in the Gemara, there's a poor couple, and they have a child, but sadly, the woman dies in childbirth and he has no money to pay a wet nurse. So he grows two breasts like the breasts of a woman and nurses his child. And Rav Yossi says, what a righteous man this must have been for God to perform such a miracle. And Abaye says, what a wicked man this must have been for God to contort the laws of nature in his body. And I ask students, tell me, do you think a man with breasts is a wonder like Rav Yosef or a monster like Abaye? And we explore where people's familiarity makes them comfortable and where difference feels monstrous. And how do we turn monstrous difference into wondrous difference?
Right. That's beautiful. And that comes up a lot for me in songwriting because, you're supposed to write from your own experience. But, the Hebrew Institute of Long Island and the Hebrew Academy of Five Towns in Rockaway and Rabbi Chait's Yeshiva, I don't know that everyone's going to relate to that. So you have to find the nuggets of truth and facts from those experiences and connect them to broader stories. That's why when I'm in a mode of exploring other, I will explicitly choose topics. Topics come to me and then I have to make the choice to go with them. Songwriting is very rarely purely an intellectual exercise for me. It's streams of consciousness. It's prompts. It's walking on the beach and seeing something or someone. Where my brain takes me is always surprising to me. And sometimes for some of these songs, I will do the research, encounter people that I'm writing about. And sometimes it's just imagining, but it's a way for me, ham-fisted or not, of trying to get to know that which is not myself, to find in that which I think is not myself, the commonalities, because at the end of the day, we're all just people.
Right. Well, there's a lot of deep wisdom in figuring out how we're addicted to familiarity and how otherness can move from being disturbing and even terrifying to being enlightening and engaging and expanding of the self. So that is part of my work, to get people who ordinarily are frightened by difference to calm down and listen to somebody else's experience. And instead of thinking of, a trans person or a gay person as something yucky, which, certainly there are plenty of people who would feel that way because they throw themselves into that space. Just listening to the life stories of other people, we've discovered that narrative, just people telling their stories, is the best resource for expanding our capacity for difference. There's also something else that you mentioned that I want to push back a little bit.
Please.
The notion that what really we need is to know what we share. I think the best research on this suggests that while there is that, and that recognition of similarity goes so far, but there really needs to be a way to live through the profound difference of others and tolerate it, and even be curious about it, while we have not yet necessarily found the common denominator. And there's something about that that feels to me more hopeful, only because when we look for commonality, we often end up with banal alliances of, yes, we both know what it is to be a parent, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't actually address the conflict of difference. What do I do? And this is happening in America everywhere, where somebody's strong opinion is morally horrific to me. How do I live in relationship to a neighbor who I believe is making profound mistakes? And how do I live with him when he thinks I am? And that, figuring out that conversation more deeply without evacuating it into what do we share, is probably as important.
You're not going to get any disagreement from me on that. I think that that's the harder piece, but if you start there, you're destined to fail. So you have to find your connections before you can explore your differences.
I want to carry us back to the beginning of our conversation, past it's true that we're so in this moment of the inability to deal with difference that it's very seductive to talk about it. But what's phenomenal about this psalm is that it brings all these radically different forces and realities and makes them all part of a shared chorus, not because they're the same, but because they're different.
Right. That's beautiful. And that would include, honestly, it reminds me of Milton. Milton talks about, there's this concept that comes up on music, I think, where it's the exponent of harmonies. So each note has within it 8 overtones, and each overtone has 8 overtones. So you get, the full spectrum of sounds singing together. And it could be that that's specifically a reference to Psalm 148. I'd have to go back and look at that.
Well, it's the ability to recognize in any, in the pattern of a leaf, the fingerprint of God is a piece of this psalm too. It's not only that everything is coming together, but the Creator is evident in the, in the wing of a gnat. And to imagine that is held alongside the planets and the sun and the moon and the stars. I think that consciousness is what you meant when you said the enormity in song, is that how do we reflect the kind of awe that we feel of the enormity of existence? How do we transmit that experience to our kids?
Right.
How do we ensure that they witness that?
Right. Oh, that's very beautiful. And there's so many different ways to do it. Walking in nature, writing poetry, helping young people and their families struggle with coming out and sustaining them after they've come out. All of these are manifestations of, I think, being awash in the enormity.
We began talking about the magnetism of the Creator that leads to creation, first of, inanimate, then animate, then moving, then sentient, then human. And that move, that all things are moving toward God, is very central to me. And I find it in the psalm, but I wanted to share the profundity of that idea in the words of Rav Kook, if you'll allow me.
Please.
He says, and I'm not going to quote, I'm just going to give you the rough thing because it's from Orota Tshuva in chapter 4. And he says, penitence or tshuva involves raising the world to perfection in all the ways imaginable, from the personal life of each individual, including the smallest constituent of special penitential reforms that the Holy Spirit can itemize in the tiniest details, all including the cultural reforms which the world rises from decadence, the improvements in social and economic order that redress every form of wrongdoing, from the most significant to the minutest ordinances of the later sages, to the most extreme demands of the ethically sensitive spirits, all of them constitute an inseparable whole.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, that's a great way to wrap this up. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me. You continue to inspire me in so many ways. I love that after all these years, going back to BMT, we are still connected. It's awesome.
Thank you so much, Shep. It was really a lot of fun. And you described this process of it not being discursive in the sense of there's a psalm and it's about these topics, and here are things that are about that topic, but it's this, in a way, organic, experiential, and it works on a psychological and emotional plane that is not necessarily about rationality. There's something about that artistic move that is a way moderns can find their way back.
Yeah.
Because often our approach to religion is to see these resources and describe them, as opposed to employing them to color our world. And that is what you're doing. So I'm grateful for the invitation that this might inspire other people to do, if not in music, in other ways.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, at the end of the day, for me, one of the things I've learned, this is from the teachings of Ellis Delaney. Do you know them? Do you know Ellis? Their music? Worth checking out. The first class I took with them at song school, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, they asked, what is your why? Why do you do this? And, they asked us to come up with one word. And my word was connection. So that's what this is all about. It's making connections with people, making connections with the text, hopefully connecting with the creator. I'm so accustomed to saying God, but it's really that which is greater than ourselves. And in that way, connecting with each other. So I'm going to take your words as a bracha that these conversations help people connect.
Amen.
Thanks so much for listening. Special thanks to Rabbi Greenberg for joining me, to Liz Hanellin for co-writing this and so many other songs with me, to Emil Stern for his help in producing this episode, to E. Rose for his help producing the song and the episode, and to Jessica Hannah Sweedler for her help on social media, to Liat Silvera for designing the podcast logo, and to my wife Shari, who gives me the time, space, and support to make the music and this podcast happen, and who's just there for everything in so many ways. You can find Like Sailors and all of the other songs in this song cycle on most platforms that stream or download music, including Spotify and Apple. In the next episode of The Rest is Commentary, I will be talking with Dr. Sarah Bunin Ben-Or, director of the Jewish Language Project, professor of contemporary Jewish studies and linguistics at Hebrew Union College, an incredible musician, and my co-writer on Into the Wow. We will be talking about the intersection of ancient Jewish wisdom and contemporary music, the role of spirituality, community, and creativity in life, personal rituals to enhance spirituality, the importance of community and connections, the importance of awe, humor and wordplay to enrich Jewish cultural expression, creativity as a central theme in life, prayer as an expression of desire rather than a request to a deity, experiencing awe in everyday life, and so much more. All of that was inspired by Sarah's thoughts about our writing process on Into the Wow, which was inspired by Psalm 118 and was sung by Rebecca Orantes. Please join us.